The Family Feud studio in June 2026 was prepared for what appeared to be a standard taping session when 47-year-old Katherine Morrison walked onto the stage, alongside four individuals who would be identified not as her family, but as the people who had saved her life during the darkest period of her existence. The composition of her team was unusual from the outset, consisting of Dr. James Chen, the emergency room physician who had treated Katherine following her suicide attempt 3 years earlier, Sarah Williams, the crisis counselor who had talked Katherine through her first night in psychiatric care, David Thompson, the support group facilitator who had provided weekly guidance during Katherine's recovery, and Katherine's 14-year-old daughter Emma, who had been the reason Katherine ultimately chose to fight for survival rather than surrender to the despair that had nearly consumed her. What transpired over the next 2 hours would demonstrate that sometimes the most profound transformations occur not through dramatic singular moments, but through the accumulated impact of small acts of compassion extended by strangers who become essential to someone's continued existence. Steve Harvey began his standard introductions with both families competing that afternoon, establishing the typical pre-game atmosphere of lighthearted competition and family bonding. When he reached Katherine's team, he immediately noted the unconventional structure, with team members who appeared to represent professional rather than familial relationships. He inquired about the team composition, asking Katherine to explain who these individuals were and why she had chosen them to appear on Family Feud with her. Katherine's response was measured and deliberate. She explained that she had assembled this particular team because these were the people who had literally saved her life, and she wanted to use this platform to publicly acknowledge their intervention and to discuss the reality of suicide, mental health crisis, and the critical importance of professional intervention and human connection during periods of severe psychological distress. Steve Harvey's demeanor shifted immediately upon hearing Katherine's explanation, recognizing that this episode would address subject matter far more serious than typical game show content. He made the decision to pause the planned competition and instead create space for Katherine to share her story comprehensively. Chairs were brought onto the stage, and what followed was Katherine's detailed account of the circumstances that had led to her suicide attempt 3 years earlier, the series of interventions that had prevented her death, and the long process of recovery that had brought her to this moment of public testimony about mental health crisis and survival. Katherine began by providing context for her mental state 3 years earlier. She had been a single mother struggling to support her daughter Emma after a contentious divorce that had left her financially unstable and emotionally depleted. She had been managing clinical depression for over a decade, but the combination of economic stress, custody conflicts, and social isolation had triggered a major depressive episode that progressed to active suicidal ideation. She described the progression from passive thoughts about death to active planning for suicide, detailing how she had researched methods, written notes to her daughter and family members, and made arrangements for Emma's care following her anticipated death. She emphasized that suicide is not typically an impulsive act, but rather often involves extensive planning and preparation, particularly among individuals who want to ensure that their death will not create additional burden for others. Katherine recounted the night 3 years earlier when she had taken a significant overdose of prescription medications with the explicit intention of ending her life. She had believed that she was making a rational decision to remove herself from a situation she could no longer tolerate, that her death would ultimately benefit her daughter by relieving Emma of the burden of a depressed and dysfunctional mother. She had ingested the medications, written a final note to Emma, and prepared to die in her home. What she had not anticipated was that Emma, who was 11 years old at the time, would return home earlier than expected from a visit with her father and would find Katherine unconscious and unresponsive. Emma had immediately called emergency services, providing critical information about her mother's condition and the medications she believed Katherine had taken. The rapid response by emergency personnel had been essential to Katherine's survival. Dr. James Chen had been the emergency room physician on duty when Katherine arrived at the hospital, and he spoke about the medical intervention required to stabilize Katherine and prevent fatal organ damage from the overdose. He described the critical first hours when Catherine's survival was uncertain, and the importance of immediate medical response to overdose situations. He emphasized that suicide attempts involving medication overdose often result in severe medical complications even when the individual survives, and that prompt emergency treatment is essential to prevent long-term damage. Catherine had awakened in the intensive care unit approximately 18 hours after the overdose, alive, but facing the realization that her attempt to end her life had failed and that she would now have to confront the circumstances that had led to that attempt. She described the profound shame and confusion she experienced upon waking, the horror of understanding that her daughter had found her unconscious, and the terror of facing the immediate future without any sense of how to proceed. Sarah Williams, the crisis counselor who had been assigned to Catherine's case, spoke about her first interaction with Catherine in the hospital, describing Catherine's initial resistance to therapeutic intervention and her expressed wish that she had not survived the suicide attempt. Sarah explained that individuals who survive suicide attempts often experience complex emotions including relief, disappointment, shame, fear, and continued suicidal ideation. She noted that the period immediately following a suicide attempt is particularly high risk for additional attempts, and that intensive therapeutic intervention and safety planning are essential during this phase. Sarah had worked with Catherine throughout her initial hospitalization and had facilitated Catherine's transfer to an inpatient psychiatric facility where she received intensive treatment for major depressive disorder and suicidal ideation. Catherine spent 3 weeks in inpatient psychiatric care, participating in individual therapy, group therapy, and medication management. She described the experience as simultaneously necessary and traumatic, noting that being separated from her daughter during this period had intensified her feelings of guilt and failure as a mother. However, the structured therapeutic environment had provided her with critical tools for managing her depression and developing alternative coping strategies to suicide. She had been discharged with a comprehensive outpatient treatment plan that included weekly individual therapy, participation in a support group for individuals with depression and suicidal ideation, and regular psychiatric medication management. David Thompson had been facilitating the support group Catherine joined following her discharge from inpatient care. He spoke about the importance of peer support for individuals recovering from suicide attempts, noting that connection with others who have experienced similar struggles can reduce isolation and provide hope that recovery is possible. Catherine had attended the support group weekly for the past 3 years, developing relationships with other members who understood the ongoing nature of depression and the continued vigilance required to maintain mental health stability. David emphasized that recovery from a suicide attempt is not linear, that individuals often experience setbacks and periods of increased struggle, and that maintaining connection to supportive resources is essential for long-term survival. Emma, Catherine's daughter, who is now 14 years old, spoke about her experience of finding her mother unconscious and the subsequent 3 years of learning to trust that her mother would continue to choose life. She described the trauma of that night 3 years earlier, the terror of not knowing whether her mother would survive, and the complex emotions she had experienced, including anger at her mother for attempting to leave her, fear that another attempt might occur, and guilt about whether she had somehow contributed to her mother's despair. Emma had participated in therapy to process these experiences, learning that her mother's mental illness and suicide attempt were not her fault and developing skills to support her mother's recovery while also maintaining appropriate boundaries. Emma stated that the most difficult aspect of the past 3 years had been learning to accept that her mother's depression was a chronic condition that required ongoing management rather than something that would be permanently resolved. She described the anxiety she experienced when her mother appeared withdrawn or sad, the hypervigilance about monitoring her mother's medication compliance, and the gradual process of learning to trust that Catherine had developed sufficient coping skills to manage difficult periods without resorting to suicide. Emma expressed pride in her mother's recovery and gratitude to the professionals and support group members who had helped Catherine survive and rebuild her life. Steve Harvey, who had been listening to these testimonies with visible emotion, addressed each of the team members individually, thanking them for their roles in Catherine's survival and recovery. He spoke to Dr. Chen about the importance of emergency medical personnel in suicide intervention, noting that rapid response and skilled medical treatment are often the difference between life and death in overdose situations. He thanked Sarah Williams for her work as a crisis counselor, acknowledging that the immediate post-attempt period requires specialized therapeutic skills and that Sarah's intervention had been essential to Katherine's willingness to engage in treatment. He expressed appreciation to David Thompson for facilitating the support group that had provided Katherine with ongoing connection and hope during the long recovery process. Steve's interaction with Emma was particularly emotional. He acknowledged the burden that Emma had carried as a child who found her mother dying, expressing sorrow that Emma had experienced such trauma at a young age. He noted that Emma's quick action in calling emergency services had directly saved Katherine's life, and that Emma's continued support of her mother's recovery demonstrated remarkable maturity and resilience. He asked Emma what she wanted other young people in similar situations to understand about having a parent with mental illness and suicidal behavior. Emma's response was thoughtful and composed. She stated that young people need to know that mental illness is not a choice or a character flaw, that loving someone with depression or suicidal thoughts does not mean you can cure them or prevent all crises, and that seeking help from professionals is essential rather than trying to manage such situations alone. The conversation then shifted to the broader context of suicide prevention and mental health treatment. Katherine spoke about the systemic barriers she had encountered in accessing mental health care prior to her suicide attempt, including inadequate insurance coverage for therapy, long waiting periods for psychiatric appointments, and the social stigma that had prevented her from openly discussing her depression with friends and family. She noted that she had been struggling with suicidal thoughts for months before her attempt, but that she had not disclosed these thoughts to her therapist because she feared involuntary hospitalization or the possibility that disclosure would impact her custody arrangement with Emma's father. Sarah Williams addressed these systemic issues from her perspective as a mental health professional, discussing the reality that many individuals with suicidal ideation do not seek help because they fear the consequences of disclosure or because they lack access to affordable and timely mental health services. She emphasized the need for expanded mental health resources, reduced stigma around suicide and depression, and improved crisis intervention services, including 24-hour hotlines and mobile crisis teams. She noted that suicide is a leading cause of death in the United States, particularly among middle-aged adults like Katherine, and that improved prevention efforts could save thousands of lives annually. Dr. Chen spoke about suicide from a medical perspective, noting that many emergency room physicians encounter patients who have attempted suicide, and that the immediate medical stabilization is only the first step in a much longer process of recovery. He discussed the importance of coordinating medical and psychiatric care, ensuring that individuals who survive suicide attempts receive immediate mental health evaluation and are connected to appropriate outpatient services upon discharge. He acknowledged that emergency departments are often overwhelmed and that psychiatric resources are limited, creating situations where individuals in crisis may not receive optimal care. Katherine addressed the question that many viewers were likely considering, which was whether she still experienced suicidal thoughts or struggled with depression 3 years after her attempt. She was forthright in explaining that she continued to manage major depressive disorder, that she still had periods of low mood and occasional passive suicidal ideation, but that she had developed coping skills and a support network that helped her navigate these difficult periods without acting on self-destructive impulses. She emphasized that recovery from a suicide attempt does not mean that depression is cured or that suicidal thoughts never recur, but rather that the individual develops better tools for managing distress and maintaining safety. Katherine spoke about the specific strategies she had implemented to maintain her mental health stability, including medication compliance, weekly therapy, regular attendance at her support group, maintaining connection with friends and family, engaging in physical exercise, and developing a written safety plan that outlined steps to take when experiencing increased suicidal ideation. She noted that Emma was aware of this safety plan and knew how to access emergency resources if Catherine's condition deteriorated. She acknowledged that asking her teenage daughter to carry this awareness was not ideal, but that transparency about her ongoing vulnerability was necessary to maintain trust and ensure that Emma would not be blindsided by future crises. The episode that aired 3 weeks later was formatted as an extended special with comprehensive content warnings and extensive resources for viewers experiencing suicidal thoughts or depression. The broadcast included information about the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, Crisis Text Line, and local mental health resources. The episode featured additional commentary from suicide prevention experts discussing warning signs, intervention strategies, and the importance of taking all expressions of suicidal intent seriously. The production team made the decision to present Catherine's story not as entertainment, but as public health education, using the Family Feud platform to address suicide in ways that could potentially save lives by reducing stigma and increasing awareness of available resources. The response from viewers was immediate and overwhelming. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline reported a significant increase in call volume in the week following the broadcast, with many callers specifically referencing Catherine's story as the catalyst for reaching out for help. Mental health organizations across the country praised the episode for its sensitive handling of suicide and mental health crisis, noting that Catherine's candid discussion of her ongoing struggles with depression provided a realistic narrative to simplistic recovery stories that suggest mental illness can be permanently cured. Thousands of viewers shared their own experiences with depression and suicidal thoughts, expressing gratitude for Catherine's willingness to speak publicly about topics that remain heavily stigmatized. Catherine's public disclosure of her suicide attempt had professional consequences that she had anticipated, but found difficult nonetheless. Her employer became aware of her mental health history through the broadcast, and while her job was legally protected, she experienced subtle changes in how colleagues interacted with her, noting increased distance and awkwardness that suggested discomfort with her disclosure. She addressed these consequences openly in subsequent interviews, acknowledging that stigma around mental illness and suicide remains pervasive despite increased public discussion, and that individuals who disclose such information often face social and professional repercussions. She argued that this stigma contributes to silence around suicidal thoughts and prevents individuals from seeking help, and that reducing stigma requires more public discussion by people willing to share their experiences despite potential negative consequences. Emma's experience following the broadcast included both positive and negative elements. Her peers at school became aware of her mother's suicide attempt, and while many expressed support, Emma also encountered instances of bullying and inappropriate questions that demonstrated the lack of understanding about mental illness among adolescents. Emma worked with her school counselor to address these issues and to educate her peers about depression and suicide in age-appropriate ways. She reflected that the public nature of her mother's disclosure had removed her choice about whether to share this aspect of her family history, but that the potential benefit of helping other families outweighed the personal discomfort she experienced. 2 years after the Family Feud episode, Catherine and Emma gave a joint interview about the long-term impact of public disclosure and the ongoing process of managing Catherine's depression. Catherine discussed the continued challenges of living with chronic mental illness, noting that she still required medication and therapy, still experienced periods of significant depression, and remained vigilant about suicide risk management. She emphasized that she was not presenting herself as completely recovered or permanently safe, but rather as someone who had learned to live with depression and to maintain safety through ongoing therapeutic work and support system engagement. Emma spoke about her evolving understanding of her mother's mental illness, noting that as she matured into mid-adolescence, she had gained more sophisticated insight into depression as a medical condition rather than a personal failing. She discussed the ways that witnessing her mother's struggle and recovery had shaped her own interest in psychology and mental health, and her intention to pursue a career in mental health services to help other families navigate similar challenges. She acknowledged that her childhood had been significantly impacted by her mother's illness, but that the experience had also given her empathy and understanding that many of her peers lacked. 5 years after the suicide attempt, Katherine had become a peer support specialist, working professionally to help other individuals recovering from suicide attempts and managing ongoing suicidal ideation. She used her personal experience to connect with clients who were navigating the aftermath of their own attempts, providing both practical guidance about recovery strategies and the hope that comes from witnessing someone further along in the process of rebuilding life after a suicide attempt. Katherine spoke about the profound meaning she had found in this work, noting that transforming her own suffering into service for others had been essential to her ongoing recovery and sense of purpose. Katherine also became involved in suicide prevention advocacy, speaking at conferences and legislative hearings about the need for improved mental health services, reduced waiting times for psychiatric care, expanded crisis intervention resources, and decreased stigma around suicide and mental illness. She emphasized the gap between current resources and actual need, noting that many individuals experiencing suicidal crises cannot access timely mental health intervention, and that improved funding for mental health services could prevent deaths that are currently occurring due to system failures. 10 years after her suicide attempt, Katherine and Emma participated in a documentary that Steve Harvey produced examining the long-term outcomes of Katherine's story and its impact on public awareness of suicide and mental health crisis. Katherine reflected on the decade since the night Emma found her unconscious, describing the journey as longer and more difficult than she had anticipated, but ultimately characterized by profound growth and renewed sense of purpose. She acknowledged that she continued to manage depression and that suicide remained a risk she had to monitor, but that she had built a life worth living through therapeutic work, supportive relationships, professional purpose, and the daily choice to remain alive despite ongoing struggles. Emma, now 24 and completing graduate training in clinical psychology, spoke about how her mother's suicide attempt and recovery had shaped her professional direction and personal values. She discussed the complexity of loving someone with chronic suicidal ideation, the ongoing fear that recurrence remains possible, and the ways she had learned to support her mother while maintaining appropriate boundaries. She expressed pride in her mother's recovery and advocacy work, while also acknowledging the lasting impact of childhood trauma related to finding her mother dying and living with the knowledge that her mother had wanted to leave her. The documentary included updated perspectives from Dr. Chen, Sarah Williams, and David Thompson about their roles in Katherine's survival and recovery. Dr. Chen discussed the importance of emergency medical intervention in suicide attempts and the critical need for improved coordination between emergency departments and mental health services. Sarah Williams spoke about crisis counseling and the specialized skills required to engage individuals in the immediate aftermath of suicide attempts, when shame, ambivalence, and continued suicidal ideation are typically present. David Thompson discussed the role of peer support groups in long-term recovery and the importance of maintained connection to supportive resources over years rather than months. The documentary concluded with Katherine speaking directly to viewers who might be experiencing suicidal thoughts or depression, offering both validation of the pain they were experiencing and encouragement that survival is possible. She stated that 3 years earlier, when she had taken the overdose that nearly killed her, she had been absolutely convinced that death was her only option and that continuing to live was impossible. She acknowledged that at that moment she had been wrong, but that her conviction had been genuine and her suffering had been real. She emphasized that suicidal thoughts, while feeling permanent and unchangeable in the moment, are symptoms of illness that can be treated and managed. She encouraged anyone experiencing such thoughts to reach out to crisis resources, to tell someone they trust, to access emergency services if necessary, and to hold on through the immediate crisis with the understanding that their emotional state will shift even if they cannot imagine that possibility in their current moment of suffering. If you have been moved by Katherine Morrison's account of her suicide attempt, survival, and ongoing recovery, please understand that suicide is not typically an impulsive decision, but rather often involves extensive planning and reflects severe psychological distress that the individual experiencing it genuinely believes cannot be resolved through any means other than death. Catherine's experience demonstrates that individuals who survive suicide attempts often go on to rebuild meaningful lives and to find purpose in their continued existence. But this outcome requires sustained therapeutic intervention, supportive relationships, and access to mental health resources that remain inadequately available to many individuals in crisis. The professionals who intervened to save Catherine's life each played essential roles that demonstrate the importance of coordinated crisis response involving emergency medical care, psychiatric intervention, and ongoing therapeutic support. Emma's immediate call to emergency services was directly responsible for Catherine's survival, highlighting the critical importance of educating young people about recognizing and responding to medical emergencies, including suicide attempts. The long-term recovery process involved not acute intervention alone, but sustained engagement with therapy, support groups, and medication management over a period of years, demonstrating that recovery from suicidal crisis requires ongoing rather than temporary support. Catherine's decision to disclose her suicide attempt publicly on Family Feud represented an attempt to reduce stigma around mental illness and suicide by demonstrating that individuals who have attempted suicide are not defined solely by that act and can recover to lead productive and meaningful lives. The disclosure also served educational purposes, providing detailed information about the progression from suicidal ideation to attempt, the interventions that prevented Catherine's death, and the long recovery process that followed. Catherine's willingness to discuss her ongoing vulnerability to depression and continued need for mental health management provided a more accurate representation of chronic mental illness than narratives suggesting complete recovery or permanent resolution of symptoms. The impact on Emma requires acknowledgement as a significant consequence of Catherine's suicide attempt and subsequent public disclosure. Emma experienced childhood trauma related to finding her mother unconscious, has lived for years with awareness that her mother remains vulnerable to suicidal thoughts, and had her privacy regarding her family situation removed by the public nature of Catherine's disclosure. These impacts, while not negating the value of Catherine's survival and advocacy work, represent real costs that children of parents with suicidal behavior often bear, and that should be considered in discussions of suicide's impact on families. The systemic issues Catherine encountered in accessing mental health care prior to her suicide attempt, including inadequate insurance coverage, long waiting periods for psychiatric services, and stigma preventing open discussion of suicidal thoughts, represent barriers that many individuals experience and that contribute to deaths by suicide that could potentially be prevented through improved access to timely and affordable mental health treatment. Addressing suicide as a public health crisis requires not only individual-level interventions, but also system-level changes, including expanded mental health resources, reduced stigma, improved crisis services, and better integration of mental health care into primary medical settings.